Okay. All right. So quick networking lab. Plug this in. So who doesn't have Python installed or who's not sure? Okay.
I don't know what you want.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, feel free to just watch too. That'd be fun to join on. And so people with laptops that you've taken them out. So one thing I learned really recently is the Python standard library has a lot of things pre-installed, and one of them is an HTTP server. So if you run Python 3-m, so here's a little command. Um, Yep. So if you run this command, Python 3-m http.server, there's a pre-installed file comes in Python, and it will take wherever you run it, like your current folder, and it will host it locally on port, I think 8000. So feel free to and make sure, and something you're willing to share, no things that you're not willing to share. And then I'll get the Wi-Fi router set up, and then we could see if you can ping each other, which might be fun. So the reason, okay, maybe pedagogically, the reason this might relate to, so what we're going to go over today is I'm going to go over some like open source EMRs, and then this kind of networking lab is just give some intuition. And one thing, like, I don't think like anyone really teaches us that well. Like when you run things on the cloud, so what's happening in the background is like you're just renting computers and you're having these computers on these shared networks. So a lot of the settings relate to this kind of stuff. But at the simplest level, it's like there's some like wireless network and computers are able to ping each other and you expose like ports and that sort of stuff. So this is hopefully a quick example of how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in this computer into the router. So I'll have it connected to both just so I have internet. And then I'll give you the first hosting the server. So I'll turn this on. And then, so make sure you have Python first. And then right. So make sure you have Python first, and then we'll get a switch to this Wi-Fi first. And then I'll show you. All right, so give it a sec to turn on. Okay, so yes, I want to connect. All right. So the way you run the command is first you go to and who here has worked with the terminal before or the command prompt in Windows? Okay, cool. So you have some people. So if you're not familiar, the terminal is just the place where you can do more like you can have more you can do more like hackery things, or you can do more programmatic actions with this. So the traditional shell, so this is called a shell. It's just historical reasons to just call it that, is where you can run commands. And then this is like a way to get closer to the operating system and just tell the operating system, hey, do this directly. The traditional way most people do it is you would have an app installed and the app calls the operating system and does all these things for you. So this is a way to just get one level closer. Okay, so in Windows, I think it's called command prompt, and Unix, which is Mac or Linux, it's just called the terminal, I guess. So go into your folder. I'm gonna go to my demo folder, and you run Python 3-m. That means module http.server. And after that, it will serve on port 8000. So what does this mean? So what this is doing, so every computer has an IP address assigned to it. And it's basically a number that identifies a computer uniquely. But IPs can be assigned at different levels. So there's and I know this at like an intermediate level. So every computer on a local network would have an IP that the local network assigns. But if you go to maybe one level above, like a more global network, like let's say the internet, then your IP is actually shared among all the computers in the router. So like if I buy internet from Xfinity, and I want to like expose this machine, via Xfinity, then I need to call Xfinity and have them assign me a public IP because they're the ones that manages that for me. But on my local network, I have this number. So please let me know if there are any questions. This is all kind of confusing. Okay, so now if I go to localhost 8000. Oh yes, that's a good question. So what is a port? So networking port. So basically, oh yes, I don't have internet. Actually, all right. Well, hopefully, okay, wait. So I'm gonna switch. I'm just doing this on the fly. So I think I gotta change the order, and the people on Zoom might have lost me. All right, network. Set. Okay. So this goes first.
I give a super quick explainer while he's figuring it out. So
Yes.
basically, like the domain google.com or whatever, that's like, Google servers, great. Everything that goes to google.com gets routed to Google. But there's when your laptop has, so a bunch of things are coming into your laptop, but different things may be coming in. For example, like an HTTP request, which is like the website, or maybe an SSH request, which would be like more on the terminal. Or maybe if you've seen like HTTP versus HTTPS, those are like different types of requests. So there's like a lot of different types of requests that can come in. And so the way that the computer deals with that is, okay, everything coming to google.com, I'm going to give each of those types of requests a different port. So like 8000 is a very common port for like local host kind of things. Oh yeah, so yeah, Eric has this up here, right? So like 443 is HTTPS. So like everything that's HTTPS, that's secure, HTTP is coming over port 443. HTTP is just port 80. So if it's the computer sees a request coming over port 80, it'll try to interpret that as an HTTP request. And so you can see there's other things like FTP, SSH is 22. There's like, yes, a ton of different protocols, and each protocol gets its own port.
Nice. Thank you, Michael. And all these ports they're like internet standards. So like arbitrary, like you could host something else on 80 if you really wanted to, but everyone just agreed. Okay, let's just agree that HTTP is sent over 80. All right, thanks, Michael. So that answers the port question. To prove that mine is working.
Yeah, and then so like you can pretend like when Eric goes to like wikipedia.com, there is actually a colon 443 at the end of it. It's just your browser hides that.
Yep. Nice, thank you. Cool. And then if you're running it locally, yes.
They're just a universal port.
Oh.
Server. 1 mega data center. Like, what does that mean technically?
No, go for it.
Okay. Mike, I want to hear your take too. So my understanding is just like, it's all like every computer has its own set of ports. So every computer will have its own port 80 or its own port whatever. And most of them have as many ports as they want. So these are standards for picking the ports. So when you think about it, like think of it in terms of you're just connecting to a computer. We don't know how big it is. We don't know what it does. It could be just my laptop. It could be this mega data center.
So it's just basically a way of triaging differently formatted incoming.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So like, here's your laptop, right? And let's say you make a request to google.com. Your laptop's request gets routed to like the Stanford router, which is what Eric has. The Stanford router routes it to like Comcast or some ISP.
Yep.
And then this gets routed probably to some data center sitting somewhere. And this data center exchanges with another data center.
Yep.
And then this finally reaches Google's server. This whole process is domain name resolution. This is the DNS process. But the packet that we send, our search query, here, this packet is an HTTPS packet. And so when this gets sent, Google has to have a bunch of ports open. This request will get routed to port number 443, and then Google will know how to interpret it. So everyone has these ports open. And it's just a way to understand incoming data, like how do I interpret it? Yeah, 322, 80, etc.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Nice. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Oh.
VM rather than laptop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That one VM and
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so you can map.
I think I can leave now.
Map my laptop or my virtual machine for it, and then.
Cool. And we'll use Docker containers too, so that is good context. So yeah, basically think of like if you're dealing with something that wants to be thought of its own unit of a computer, then it has ports. And all your ports are closed by default for security because everyone on the same router can technically ping each other. So yeah, so a lot of security things turn off by default. So that's why if anyone's like, how many people have worked with the cloud or had to provision their own things? Cool. Okay. That's why everything's like off by default in the cloud. Because if everything was on by default, it'd be chaos. Because like in the cloud, there's just this one big like you go through this whole chain and then it ends in like Columbus, Ohio or something. It's this big data server, that Amazon or Google or Microsoft owns. It's just this big warehouse. And everyone's on the same network. So they do a lot of work to like logically provision it, but just like one big site. Okay. And if you want to prove it to yourself, and if you like hack on your own, you might have seen localhost. So localhost is, and it took me a while to find this out. It's the same as 127.0.0.1. So if I go to this and colon is the port 8000, it is the same thing. And they just gave it the name localhost, so it's easier to work with. But this is just the standard, like everyone agreed upon. Okay, let's just reserve this number to mean I am talking with myself for like local debugging purposes, that sort of thing. Good question. I think it is a special kind of IP address. Yes. All right, any questions? All right, cool. And then, so what I'll do now is I'll log into the router settings and we can see everyone that is on the router. So if you want to, okay. Actually, I haven't given people the password. So the network's called BIOS 417. And the password is Happy Thanksgiving ! So it's all lowercase. So if you want to join, and then yes, and then exclamation points because security reasons. All right. Yeah, they forced me to. Okay. Try TP link. All right. So I'm gonna do a pro gamer move. Looks like okay. So sorry for the people on Zoom. I might need to turn off for a bit and switch to the local network. So I'm going to do that. But this is yes. Okay.
So you want to leave it open and not as host, so I can like zoom in and.
Oh, thanks. I think it's good. Or let me do this real quick. So let me see. So I'm off the internet now. I'm onto this little dinky white router. So let's see. Okay, so the dinky router. This is what's the password? So this is the router password. And then so what we did was we went on our local network that I brought. Zoom folks. So there's a Wi-Fi router over there. Oh. So there's a Wi-Fi router, and we went on the Wi-Fi router, and we shared our Python servers or HTTP servers. So in the way you would host this on your own is you can run Python 3-m HTTP. So I've broken this pipe, but it's pre-installed in Python, and if you want to test it yourself, you can run localhost. All right. So thanks for participating. Any questions? Okay. Next, now we'll start. So the motivation of this lab was to run some open source EMRs and then maybe like give a peek of what those repos look like. So one popular one's called OpenEMR. So first thing we can look at the docs because it's open source. Let's see. OpenEMR. So I like looking at the GitHub, but up to you. So now, okay, how many people are familiar with open source? Or we'll start with that. How many people are familiar with open source? Okay, cool, a couple of people. So the people that are new, so the idea of open source code is you publish your code in a way that anyone can access it. It's like publicly available, why would you do that? The idea is you can have more people contributing to the project. You also like put the knowledge out there. And if you have an interesting idea, it's just more egalitarian, you can share it. The ethos of it is hopefully you can attract like the brightest minds that want to like work on these kind of problems in an open way. And a lot of that happens. And also the nice thing about having open software in theory is like, if you don't like something about it, you can modify it. And so like so for OpenEMR, you could take this entire code base and modify it if you like, because it's open source. And also if you see a problem, instead of waiting for someone to fix it, you can fix it yourself, which could be cool. Now, open source is a mixed topic because yeah, it's tricky because a lot of open source work goes like is often underappreciated, and there is a conflict in the open source community of like, oh, if I open source this project and a lot of people work on it, but then Google uses it, makes $1 billion, and like, what happened? And one way to combat that as a project, or at least find the right balance, is through licensing. So every open source project usually has a license. It looks like this one is the GNU public license. So it'll tell you these things here. It's pretty permissive, which is cool. And that being said too, the other thing, so I hung out at the business school for a while, and one thing people would say is like, yeah, it's like one thing people would say is like, oh, like why would you open source it, because like your competitors can take it and yada yada. And that's true, they could take it. But another way to view it is open source is a way you could prove that you're like an industry leader or you know the most about it. It's a way to prove that like for a new hire that your practices are good and like they could really mesh. And also by the time someone has copied your code, most people, it would make more sense for them to just work for you. Because like by the time you like the thing about this code base is like, yeah, I've had that thought too. It's like, oh, what if I took OpenEMR and like ripped it off? But one, that's really hard because like a lot of work goes into this. A lot of people put a lot of thought into it. So by the time like you understand what's going on, it's like actually it would make more sense to just contribute back to the project, which is great. So it just take a while to pick this stuff up. All right. So this is the repo. You can use Git to download it. Git's a common developer tool, which is used for source control. But the way you would download this, okay, well, so I'm doing the same thing. I'm opening a terminal here. Do the same thing. Okay, I'll just go to my folder. I'll do a git clone. So this is the common practice. You can take a repo that's open, or if it's not open, just make sure you have the credentials and it'll download all the files. This might take a while because it's kind of big, but while we're waiting for that, I guess we don't have to. So one common way people run these things, I don't know if it's newer, like, so there's a company called Docker. They came out in maybe like 2010-ish. I think they're funded. Do you know if they're funded by YC or? Okay. But I like they're pretty big now. And a lot of people use it. But anyways, the idea with Docker is, and Docker has its own open source thingy. I'll find it. So Eamon brought up a good point on terms of like, oh, for ports, like, is it at the OS level, or like if you have a virtual container, then like how do ports work for that? So okay, how many people know what a virtual machine is? Okay, cool. So a virtual machine is something is basically like a logical computer. So it's basically like you can run, like I can take my one computer and logically simulate two computers. And a virtual machine does that from the ground up. Like it does it including like, oh, I've simulated the hardware and the CPU and like everything is own contained box. So people like virtual machines because you can take one big fat machine and then run multiple small ones instead of stringing together a bunch of small ones. Now, what does Docker do? So Docker isn't exactly virtual machines, but it's a very similar idea called containerization. So instead of having everything like logically separated, like I've re-simulated the CPU and I've re-simulated each layer, Docker says, okay, I will just re-simulate the app and everyone will share the same CPU. So I don't need to re-simulate the computer part. Okay, so anyways, there are a lot of these open, I guess, containers on Docker, and OpenEMR has their own. And this is basically a prepackaged kind of like app or way to run OpenEMR. And why would they do it via Docker? So more people use it. So then, the idea gets out to more people in the world, and also more people are interested. So Docker solves the problem of like it originally solved the problem of like, this doesn't work on my machine because like, like some people here might have Windows, some people might have like Mac. There might be different steps to run the same thing, and Docker kind of standardized that too. All right, so we can run OpenEMR. So I made this Docker compose file. It's just a way to put a bunch of Docker commands together in one file. And this one's saying pull the OpenEMR kind of app and then have these settings. I will host it on port 8080. So this is saying like on my computer, it will be 8080, but for the container, it will go to containers port 80. So Docker or OpenEMR by default says like, okay, everything will go to port 80, but to run it, I will have it do 8080. And then I'll also need a database. Okay, so I will run this. So Docker compose up. Okay, first I'm gotta make sure Docker's running. Cool. So as I'm running this, maybe I can get a pulse of what are people, what parts of this might people be interested in? So I could run through more apps, or I could just walk through what it looks like. Or we could just if no strong thoughts, I'll just keep going. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Good question. The thing I just ran is Docker compose up, and then what this basically what we did was we installed Docker, and then I turned Docker on. This is like the little GUI. They have to manage it. After Docker's on, and it takes a while to install, as I did before here. This Docker compose up command reads a Docker compose file within the same directory. So we went to this OpenEMR demo directory and then configure this Docker compose file. And this Docker compose file is just like a place to like put all your config in one place. And this has made 2 Docker containers. It's made one container called OpenEMR and one container called OpenEMR DB. And logically, and this is if anyone's heard the term DevOps, like this is what DevOps people do. It's this like they manage these containers and they make sure once the application people run all the write all the code. Another problem is how do you get it to run like the right way, securely, and also like in a way where if one thing breaks, something doesn't completely shut down. But yes.
Very tactical question. Is the person who do DevOps typically the same person or a different team or the same team as the DevSecOps person?
That's a good question. Traditionally, DevOps is more of a backend task. Backend engineering is the most broad. I would say like front-end engineering is just like you're building something the user will see.
Is DevSec considered like the development security not considered IAM?
That's a good question. It's kind of all like people have made these like terms for all these different things. So I've never heard DevSec. I would say like front end and back end were like the 2 most generic. Like front end was basically websites and back end was everything else. Yeah, because like it's all the stuff you don't see, right? Whereas like front end was like back, and then apps came out, so then there became app developers, and that's like slightly different from front end. And then like the cloud came, and then it's like, okay, what do we call the cloud people? And it's like, okay, that's DevOps. So then, and now there are like little branches everywhere.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, now we got this running. So let me run their app first, and then I'll show the database for people that are interested. Okay, so from the Docker compose file, we told the reason I commented this out. So this is saying like just exposing my localhost. This is saying let any IP on the same network. That's what the 0000 is. Let any IP on the same network also access this port. So if I only had this, then only I would be able to access it. But I won't recut the Zoom people. So, but that for reference, that's what this line does. All right, so now we can go here and take a look. And it's running. Okay, what's the username and what's the password? Well, that's what we set here. All right. And these environment variables are basically just like config that the developers choose. So like the environment variable is just like a standard way to port this stuff. All right, so we'll log in, admin, admit password. All right. And voila, we have an EMR running, loading. And as you'll see here, like if there are any logs. Okay, so this is one way to view it. Okay. Yeah, so this is it. This is OpenEMR. Okay, if you're, I forgot too. If you're on Zoom, they have a public one. Or also, I guess if you want to follow along too, they have a public demo. So then if you want the public demo, here it is. But it's basically the same, like the same thing, but done in they just host it on their own cloud. So like, for example, if I went here, if I went to this demo link, basically it's different language. It's kind of cool. Yeah, so that's like, oh man, I guess. So yeah, but if you notice like here, like this is just running on some computer on some server. So yeah, like they just had this, they set it up maybe a similar way. They just ran all the things and exposed the ports and make sure it goes through the network and got it running. So this is our local one. We'll just play it. But if you want to play with the demo one, you can go that. All right, is there anything people want to do with the EMR? So a funny thing is I've worked with EMRs, but I can only think of like 2 or 3 things to do. I'm not the user. So yeah. You know, it's like, well, you make a patient and you add some notes. But yeah, if there's any, maybe we can make a patient. And this is where you start to see like maybe some of the broader pain. So one of the things that motivates the industry or, you know, there's an article, Death by 1,000 Clicks, and a lot of people complain is like, why are these EMRs so clunky? Part of it is just like, yeah, just people are like, this domain of CS or, you know, the web has just gotten less love. So it's like less thinking that goes into this. Also it's just like, yeah, it's just, I'll put it this way, not to like trivialize it, but it's also, you might go here and it's like, oh, like it's requiring me to fill out these 3 things. But then the question comes up, like, how else would you do it? You know, and that's actually a very hard question. Yes.
Do you think would be necessary to make these EHRs more usable? Like, we could say
Mhm.
like industry is also kind of work on that, but then
Yes.
stands to check for you.
Yes.
So like, they also have no clear incentive except for, you know, people want to use it. So is it that there's not like a government office of usability that will software versus better?
That's a great question. So the question, no, thanks, Jing. So the question was like how can we improve the incentives to make EHRs more usable? And like, you know, other industries have seen this, like banking. So fintech's similar to healthcare in a lot of ways too. It's funny, like I think the only other users of M is also in fintech. I don't know why. So, oh, interesting. Okay, well, you know, thanks. I think there are incentives, and that's kind of what but the problem was from the first lecture slides, you can like the government started with like, let's just force everyone to use what we have now. But you know, what we had now like wasn't the most usable. So that's why it became a problem. It was like more retroactive. So because like the usage was forced, and the usability was low, there was actually no incentive to push it first, but now there are more incentives to improve it. Yeah. Yes.
So if you think about like kind of enforcing now that everyone's on the standard, at least on the academic medical center side, where
Yep.
Epic has not sure that now we kind of work with their stuff to make it more useful. Like
Yep.
we have on the extreme and kind of open source code where it's kind of pre-used. But if you then work with Epic, like how do we try to get them to make it more useful? Because if it's
Yeah.
Death by 1,000 clicks, there's a non-negligible amount that the bad software could be causing bad clinical decisions or like,
Yes. Yes. Another great question. To rephrase for people on Zoom, like there are a lot of usability efforts. Like Epic has a conference called UGM, like a users group meeting every year. They do a lot of these things. So like like open source might be one extreme, but how might we work with existing like vendors and that sort of stuff. I think that's what people hope like the FHIR movement will be. Because the idea is like with FHIR is like you will share your, like you will have a standard way of sharing your data. So then the backend problem solved. And the next level is, okay, can we have these meta standards that build on top of FHIR on how we like interact with apps? So like smart on FHIR is like, okay, if I had an app, how do I authenticate? It solves that problem. So in theory, like if you solved each of these problems, then anyone could build any app they wanted. Now, another tricky thing too is, and this is like an interesting open question, what's a compelling clinical app? Like, I think people want the space to be better, but there's no clear answer for that. And like I TA'd a class, so before coming to Stanford, I was at Georgia Tech for like their OMS program. Love the program, pitch it to everyone. And like so I was a TA for a class called Intro to Health Informatics, and we would have everyone do like, you know, the first half of the class would be like about FHIR and these different standards, and then we would have people do like their own like IT project. And I might have mentored like, you know, like 6 projects a semester. I did not know what to tell people, you know. I'm just like, all right, well, okay. And then the thing is like the teaching staff didn't really know either. Like they were like, okay, just it can't be trivial like a BMI calculator because that's just one calculation. So we all agreed on that. But then when it came to like what was a good example, then you know, we're in these meetings and no one really knew. So but maybe like some things that are more concrete is like, you know, radiology imaging, because like there's a lot of data there clearly. And the tricky thing though is like a lot of these care coordination type things might be more like, it's not necessarily healthcare agnostic, but it's more about like consumer than healthcare. Yeah.
Like there's no financing for it, so whether you use Epic or not, you're still going to get reimbursed on the claim, but there's no extra incentive payment to make it prettier.
Yeah, yeah.
On FHIR, we've had that for a couple of years. But
yes.
Any new EMR space trying to like rival Epic in terms of making the systems more usable? It just like feels like everybody just uses the industry standard.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's the basic meta problem that it's a good point. I don't have a clear answer. But my bet that I'm very curious about is okay, well first like the base problem is like there's no incentive for people to make these things more usable if they're already raking up like a bunch of money, which makes sense. Like why would they change something that works? Though people do try. But that means saying it's not like a top line item. One way to incentivize it might be it's either you like focus on building this like open dev culture and you try to attract the best developers, and then over time they'll just grow on its own. I think that's why these open like Medplum I'll go over to is an interesting open source initiative that hopes to make it, but it's hard. It's still early. The other answer is I could share after class. I have some ideas on this. Yeah, but unsolved. And if people are interested in working on this, happy to answer any questions because we need more smart people working on this. All right. So yeah, OpenEMR, it's like nothing crazy. Now the thing, a lot of unsung work goes into here, and you might notice is like one thing you might think is like, damn, this is cluttered. There's a lot of stuff going on. But the other thing is like they had to build a lot of features. They had to build a lot of these things, and a lot of these things are like driven by government requirements. Like if you want to get reimbursed, like there's probably a feature in here for like, I don't know, every time you click like, you know, I'm Bob's doctor and I recorded an allergen, you know, first it's like, man, how do I do that? Right. But it's like, let's say I record an allergen. Oh, it's probably here. There we go. Yeah, no, how it worked. It's funny. When I was at Epic, like basically like you go through, if anyone's curious what Epic certification is, you basically like do this for like the different Epic modules. And then it's kind of like cloud certifications where it's like, oh, if I'm Google Cloud certified, then I know how to go through the Google Cloud, you know, UI. And you might ask, how valuable is that? Well, it's actually pretty valuable because like a lot of people use it, but it's not necessarily like, it's still technical because it's like, yes, I need to like think in a very structured way, but it's not like you're pushing code and doing all this crazy Docker stuff. Yeah, it's like you just go, but it's still hard. It still takes a lot of work, and that's why these things have evolved. Anyways, like there's probably a feature in here is like, yeah, if I add an allergy, like it might be firing a message in the background to say like, hey, if I configure a vaccine, you know, like some states have vaccine registries, and if you want to be government certified, then every time, you know, something gets updated, that registry needs to know. So you need to prove to the government through certification that that feature's there. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background. We can actually see if it does that. Probably not. Yeah. And then so what I'm looking to is like each one of these might be cleaner to look this way. Like each one of these has its own logs. So I can look in here and like where do the logs come from? The logs are just like, I don't know, whatever the developer felt like putting in there, it is there, like, like any good developer's done this. You write code and you're like, does this work? So you write a bunch of print statements, and if they forget to take it out, then it shows up here. There are better ways to do it, but yeah, it's completely reasonable. You just print stuff. All right. So that is OpenEMR. Any questions or any things people are curious about? All right. Cool. So as I stop that, the next thing, and then I will next thing, and then I'll free you all from this geeky stuff. And then, all right. So what is Medplum? So OpenEMR is like a traditional kind of EHR. Actually, all right, one more geeky thing. So I'll go back. So I stopped the container, but I'll restart it. So, if you run these things, you can actually inspect the database yourself. So I don't know how much people care, but I will do it anyways for education. So there are tools where, so the database where I just entered the fake patient Bob Figgins, it has its own port. So you can specify like, hey, I want to expose the port. So the database they use is a database called MySQL. And MySQL, and this stuff is like this is healthcare agnostic. Like, everyone in the industry just uses different databases. You might have heard Postgres, MySQL, whatever. So MySQL just uses a port. So we can inspect this directly if we wanted to. So one tool that I've used before is called dbeaver. So I will ignore this. It just lets you a way to like peek into some of these databases. So I've already pre-configured this. The way you configure it is, this looks like a monstrosity, but all you do is you put your username, your password, which we've set here, and then you can just link it up. So if we take a look, what's happening in the OpenEMR database? So a database has tables. You look, there's a bunch of tables, and like people have built this out. If I want to find Bob, all right, there it is. So I made one from before, and this is Bob Figgins. He's he or she, they is in the database, and there are all these. So this is interesting too. If you noticed, for the table, like all the columns are pre-populated, but a lot of these values are empty. So like that has to go with the whole like sparse dense trade-off. So for most like applications, or this actually happens a lot. It's not that bad space-wise, but outside of healthcare, you might have tables where like things are mostly full, and because you can design it that way. But the more edge cases you have, the more tables just in case you'll need. So when I add, and if we go back to the page, there was maybe like 12 little boxes, right? And I just filled 3 of them, so that's why it was sparse. But they had to, all these have a reason for being there. So, and this is part of the design challenge. It's like, okay, you can try to make the trade-off and make it as elegant as possible, but how do you also encapsulate all these use cases? All right. So that's the database, and how did I know to look there? I just guessed. Like the developers just picked whatever structure they wanted, and I just assumed like, well, this is patient data, so maybe it's in the patient data, right? But so this is what like the OpenEMR's developers just decided to do it this way. Play reasonable. All right. So that is like a more traditional EMR. It's just like a regular app. It has a database, it has a front end, and then you can run it all together. But there's a new idea coming out of like, could you build like, so instead of everyone just redeciding on, what to name a table for the same thing, like whether patient data, or should I make it the patient table, or should I make it the person table, right? What if everyone just used the same like structure of the database, agreed upon that? Could it be faster to build things? And that's one idea. So, and that's being called a headless EMR right now, or like a destructured EMR, whatever. So one of those is called Medplum. I'm pretty high on them. They're based in SF, and they're founded, like they went through YC, I think last year or the year before. But anyways, like the whole idea of Medplum is okay, we will just be the database layer, and like our tables will be pre-constructed to match FHIR, and we will write a lot of like the backend application, like the EMR specific logic. And that might be something like the vaccine registry thing, or it might be like exporting to like a CCD or whatever. So that's something traditionally, if you're a new EMR startup, you'd have to be like, yes, we're in, like first we build our app and we make it elegant, yada, yada. And then, your customer comes to you and they're like, oh, but, we need you to be ONC certified because our old one, we want to switch to you, but like, we got to make sure all these requirements are there. And then you go through the big checklist and you're like, holy smokes, there's a lot of random things. Like when I was at Canvas, like one feature, we went through ONC certification. I joined in like late 2021 and I think they started getting ONC certified in like 2019. And by the time I joined, the project was like delayed by like 6 months, like twice. And I was like, oh shit, like, well, this is top priority now. Like I'm working on this. So the feature I was working on was the vaccine registration thing. That's why it's top of mind. But it was tricky too, because like, basically like Canvas like has their own charting interface. And basically there was a field that they were like the state required vaccine registries to have, but we just didn't have it. Like, people didn't enter it in the charting interface. So then that's a weird design question. It's like, okay, do we retroactively add this thing that most people don't need, but the government has required us to do? And I forgot what we did. But I think we added it, but it was like there might have been like 2 commands instead of 1. Some hacky thing. But that being said, that's kind of the challenge of retrofitting. Maybe why like we haven't seen some of the like user UX innovation, because if you drive it through government regulation and you retrofit it after, it's just hard to make that, seamless or make it nice. So the idea with Medplum is, okay, they will handle all of like the government regulation stuff, ideally. So like they have an ONC certified version. And as long as you work with their database, then you will be ONC certified and you can just focus on building the app part. So it can be more modular. Any questions on that? Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's funny. It's like,
If you don't know, I found.
yeah. You know what? Like, I so the question was just like, what kind of things are these like health tech startups doing now? I think completely like so I haven't recently looked this up, but my guess is there are people like the place with the most money is billing. So like there are a lot of people trying to play like the sub billing games of like billing codes and like, oh, can I get reimbursed more for doing this thing, or can I encourage this reimbursement code, whatever. So actually, if you want a profitable exit, that might be a place to focus. Um, and then besides that, you have people that are, yeah, I'm not really sure. There's a bit of an AI bull rush in terms of like, oh, well, that helps sales, but the use cases are kind of dubious. And then besides that, I think a lot of things end up being some sort of like SaaS middleware, where it's just like, oh, we'll like optimize this small problem within this big muck of a system, which is a big problem, and then we'll take a cut of that. But to do that, you need to go through, my little pipe. But I'm biased because I'm mostly like a backend guy. Yeah. So, but like it's interesting. The hope for something like Medplum is like, and I can start to get it running. The hope of something like Medplum is like they want to be the backend platform, and then people can just focus on like the front end user experience. That being said, I think and this is interesting. They have, so let me start running this. So I have a Docker Compose file. We can take a look at it later. And then and the thing I really like about Medplum is like they're doing it in an open source way. So if you see like they have their base repo, so this is the one that's gotten the most interest is just like their base EMR, and this is like their database. And this is the main one they push code, but they also push a lot of these like demo apps. So they have an app that simulates like a provider interface. They have an app that simulates like if you want to make a scheduling app. That being said, in terms of like features, this might basically be like a lot of the OpenEMR features, but like kind of split out into separate things. But the idea is like if you focus on one thing at a time instead of trying to boil the ocean, you can be more efficient. Or there might be like smarter ways, right? Like for example, a big perk of buying Epic is you get all 20 modules at once, right? What if there's a world where you can say like, okay, I love everything about Epic except cardiology. So then, but there's this other cardiology thing all my cardiologists love. They really want it to work. What if you could just plug it in and it all works together? So that might be a world that Medplum's like pushing towards. I'm also really bullish on that, but it'll take a lot of work. But anyways, they have all these like little side apps, and these side apps like use TypeScript, which is a variant of JavaScript. And this is what like modern web people use. So the idea is like if we use more modern web stuff, we will kind of, and I'll say too, like I love the approach. It's really hard to do because there's a bit of a drain. It's a very biased take. Like there's a bit of a brain drain in like health tech IT because it's like healthcare is just more political and it's like behind on the tech. So then most of the devs that are good enough to like choose not to do that, they just go somewhere else. They'll just be like, oh, like, I'll just go to Facebook and like, make a bunch of money, but I hate my job because like I'm just doing social media. But I can't give it up. So, and it's hard. It like completely makes sense. And not gonna lie, I only ended up at Epic because I couldn't get a job at Google. So, but it's led me here. So here we are. And yes, I've definitely learned a lot. Yeah, at the time I was just like, oh, how great would it be if I could work for Google Health because I don't need to deal with this brain drain and I could do something health related. But as you like I think they're also doing interesting stuff, but it's hard to like retrofit some of the stuff. Anyways, so that's kind of the motivation of what Medplum is. I'll show you a demo app and how to run it. So like this repo here, I just like pulled this from the so let's go to food medical. Okay, so this is Medplum demo food medical. So this food medical repo, it's open source, which means you could just pull it. All right, you just pull it from the public listing. Where is it? It is, yep, it's here. So, and one of the co-founders of Medplum, Cody, he was former, I think like either CTO of head of engineering of One Medical. So a lot of experience there, and they made this mock site. So if you're like a small clinic and you want to spin up a website, then this is an open source one and it'll work with Medplum. And why would you want it to work with Medplum? Well, like if you schedule an appointment with a patient, you would love for the EMR to just work and like no. So that's why like the scheduling or this website might need to link with Medplum. So I pulled this down. This is the repo. If you want to, every repo should aim to have a good README, so you can read this and it'll tell you how to get started. But yeah, and at this point, okay, so like the open source code, another reason why it's hard to rip off is like every dev just like picks what they like the most and they just code in that, and people can be very opinionated. I'm very opinionated. I don't like JavaScript or Java, but a lot of people use it. And it makes sense too. So if you want to rip off an open source project, please try to contribute back, one, and two, like it's harder than you think. It is a lot harder than you think because by the time you've learned everything, you're like, man, like, yeah, I hate Java too. And it's like, oh, but then why I spend the next 10 years doing Java? Like, I hope not. Yeah. So, all right. So the thing I ran was npm install. npm is just JavaScript lands install thing. And then and this is a JavaScript thing. I don't think if people care or people are interested. So the way JavaScript does it is they put everything in this package.json file, and then you can run these little commands that are shorthands. So then if I run npm run, then I can call one of these shorthand commands, and then I'll run this thing. So npm run dev, anytime you have an npm project, you can use that same command, but what's doing under the hood is just substituting it for this, like Vite. Why would you do it the standard way? It's like, well, people, it might be easier if you just work in JavaScript. Like there are 1,000 different projects, they all use something different. This might be a way to standardize that. All right, so if I do npm run dev, if you see it's hosting on my localhost 3000, And here it is. It's Fu Medical. And how does it know? Okay, I don't know if I put the Eric there. I'm actually a little surprised, but you know what? Okay. Oh, this is interesting. You know, let's inspect the database. So I think it's Oh no, like okay, wait. Okay, I know why. I know why. Yeah, I forgot. Okay, so another thing, and we can wrap up soon. Um, how might an open source company make money? So a lot of these companies, like the example I love giving, or just because I know, is like Elastic. They have a platform called Elasticsearch, which a lot of people use. It's very popular. It is open source. So if you go to GitHub, Elasticsearch, and GitHub isn't the only place, but it's the place where most of these things are. Yeah, you can just download it and use it. But Elasticsearch's license is more restrictive. So basically, the way they made money is like everyone loved Elasticsearch. People use it in projects, students used it. They got jobs, like they liked it, and they have a cloud version. So they say like, hey, like you could go through all this like weird Docker stuff and try to run it, but you need DevOps experience. And even me, like I know how to do it, but like I wouldn't feel comfortable like doing a ton of this in production. But or you could just like do our nice managed cloud platform. So if you know Elastic, then we're the ones who made it. You can trust us, and then make money off of that. Now, the reason their license is more restrictive is, yeah. So GNU Affero public license. So I think this license is basically like you can use us, but if you do and you charge money, then you also need to open source your entire code base, or else you can get sued. And do people sue in practice? Like maybe not that much, but like technically you could take this to court and make it a thing. So the reason they made it more restrictive, usually it's like less restrictive, so people don't need to worry about that or stress about it. And this happened in I think 2021. So AWS made a fork of Elasticsearch, which is very controversial. So traditionally when you fork a project, it means you make a copy, and completely okay, dude. There's nothing wrong with that. But the idea is like most times when you fork, you're doing it to either use it for yourself just locally or to contribute back, right? So you need to fork it to give it back. But what AWS did, they were like, you know what, we disagree with how Elasticsearch does this. So they basically forked Elasticsearch. They started, they took their own developers, made a team, and built on top of like the past 10 works of 10 years of Elasticsearch, and they made it to their own AWS service. They called it like Elastic Net or something. I don't know. They called it something, and they hosted it on AWS. And technically, by the old license, that was completely legal to do. But it was really fucked up because it's like, man, like that's a terrible look. Like, and you have all this money, right? It's just like, why don't you just, like, why don't you do it nicely? So Elasticsearch changed their license. This is interesting because, like, when I was at Canvas, like, we were running Elasticsearch and we were on AWS. So because of the license change, we couldn't upgrade our version of Elasticsearch because of this legal thing, because they forked, right? Because of this legal reason. And then we couldn't upgrade because we're on AWS. Yes.
Really the tragedy of the situation where basically take advantage and just kind of ruin it for all of us.
Yes, that's a good question. Like I think it's like similar spirit, yeah. And it's not necessarily, and it's hard because like I've wrangled with this too. Like some places I've worked, like I won't say where, but like yeah, some places I worked, like they just like ripped some open source products, and some people like had the vibe of like, oh, like look at us, how smart business people, we're using all this old code and we can sell it. And I'm just like, man, like it's like that's actually completely in their right depending on their license, but just the vibe's terrible. So it's like, and I think that's why I want to think of a more formal way to put it, but it's a vibes check thing, and like that's why the brain drain happens. That's like the long tail effect. So the short tail is like not a problem, but the long tail is a problem. So, but hopefully there's like ways to counterbalance that. Sweet. All right. Thanks everyone for listening. Are there any other questions on Zoom or? Yes, Alex.
Similarly to you, I've been following Medplum for quite a while, and I think they're really interesting. Obviously, they use the standards first approach, and everything is based on HL7's FHIR, which obviously is kind of like this interoperability standard. That's kind of what it's known for. Given that they kind of have kind of like the bare bones of the database and different providers or services can build their applications off of that. Do you know kind of if and how they kind of sort of incentivize these various different companies that use Medplum to share data between themselves? Is there like a management process between that? Because obviously HL7 Fire and the interoperability game is kind of about that community and sharing. So
Yes.
is that like quite an important feature of their service? I'm curious.
So that's a great question. And maybe to summarize, like, so Medplum like wants to create this community built on open standards, more people use it. But if someone uses Medplum, like what would incentivize them to share with maybe other Medplum users, or like are there any incentives like that? There are no incentives. So but I think like the spirit of what they're doing, and this is why like open source is like controversial, or it's like might be more washy, because like people really want to foster like the spirit and the energy of like people are doing this because they think it's cool or they're passionate about it or they want to have an open community, but there's no way to enforce it. So it's really a cultural thing. And it, as you know, and like many people know, it's like these cultural things are very long tail solutions. It's hard to kick it off. So there's no way for Medplum to force it. However, I think the spirit of where they're coming from is something a lot of people want to support. So I think that's the most they could do. And then maybe like, I don't know, if they really wanted to, they could say like, I think I met their founders, and I think technically every AWS box is like completely isolated from each other because of HIPAA reasons. So but if they really want to, they could, they technically have access to all of them in some way, or they could just ask. But yeah, but I will say like it's probably easier between Medplum companies, because if at the end of the day, if they really need the data, it might just turn out it's like you just need to call someone, and then if you two know each other, then it's just easier to facilitate that.
And quick follow-up question to that, and this is probably more of a hypothetical.
Mhm.
You're saying that there's not sort of really an incentive that can be provided, at least from the business perspective, and at least initially because of HIPAA, there's a
Yep.
requirement to keep instances separate. Um, what if patients consented for the sharing of their data? Would that be a pretty solid legal basis if consent was given for some reason?
Yes, that's a great question. So basically, like, can patients like push these initiatives either through like legal consent or these other things? They can, and I think there is legal power. There is very, very little legal precedent, so there isn't enough. Like, it's just like someone can argue that like, yes, it's my right to do this, but there isn't much case law, and no one's going to hire a lawyer. There's actually and I was able to join like recent. There's a really cool project called the Sequoia Project, and they have a patient work group meeting about like record usability. So they're a nonprofit, and like let me see, yada yada. Yeah, they have this program called Interoperability Matters, and so I was at the consumer. I think I was at this meeting, but it's basically like a committee, and there's maybe like 30 people that like get on this Microsoft Teams call, and like it, it's um it's really noble because it's like a bunch of people from the different like vendors in the industry. But yeah, like the last call was just like one of the committee leads. She was mentioning that like, yeah, like I know like the head of the ONC, like Mike Tripathi, like we're sitting next to each other, and I had this terrible experience in like the ER, and I couldn't get my medical records. And it was crazy because I know so much, and even knowing like trying to go through the process, like she's basically talking about all her pain points. And it's like, even though like abstractly, like she had all this knowledge and she even knew the people. It's like this problem wasn't solved. So like this is kind of how it manifests. And it's like okay, the most we can do is we can have this work group, and then we can kind of have people support each other, and then maybe have broader efforts. But not gonna lie, like I feel like these are the types of people like I really want to serve in my career, because they are trying their best to like keep the spirit alive. And also a lot of people go through a lot of like obscure pain. Like another really cool evangelist. His name's ePatient Dave DeBronkart. He's basically a retired marketer, and he just spends like all day now just evangelizing this issue because he's so passionate about it. I met him at Fire Dev Days. So, and he's super friendly. Yeah, he's just like this. I think he's from yeah, yeah, somewhere in like I forgot, like Central America. Um yeah, he's super energetic, super nice, and he just cares a lot about like, yeah, just give me my damn records. And it's silly because it's like that's how it manifests, and it is an important issue. There is a way to solve the business problem or incentives, but it I think I have a lot of thoughts. Happy to chat more. Like it'll have to be more roundabout. Like it's not as like simple or direct. Yeah. But hopefully one day, more of these efforts kind of manifest. Cool. Any other questions? Sweet. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving, and feel free to grab more food. Cool. Thank you. Good question. No class next week. Yes. So no class. So we're not meeting.
Tuesday, there is no class either.
Yes, that is correct. So then next Tuesday for Thanksgiving week, we have no class, but the week after we'll have our last two classes. So the December 3rd and 5th.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
All right, thank you.
OpenEMR, I never heard of that.